Arguing against protests is fine, but what's the best way to argue against protests? What's the ideal way to argue against protests? That's what we're going to cover in this video. There are two main ways to argue against protests: ideas-based critiques and tactics-based critiques. Ideas-based critiques attack the reasons behind the protest. Tactics-based critiques attack the strategies behind the protests. This distinction can help us to think about protests in general. But thinking in general terms is a bit tricky. It's easier to think about something concrete, a concrete particular example, to then think about the general. So we're going to look at the particular example of the 2022 Canadian trucker convoy protests. These protests were also called the Freedom Convoy protests. If you don't know about them, don't worry. I'm going to explain them in this video. After looking at the trucker convoy protests, we're then going to think about protests in general. We're then going to think about the big picture. This big picture will then apply to all protests. So don't get bogged down in the particular example of the trucker convoy protest. We're just using the trucker convoy protest as a stepping stone to then think about all protests. The trucker convoy protests were these protests that occurred in Canada. Basically, a group of truckers were protesting against COVID-19 restrictions, in particular vaccine mandates. Truckers from around Canada drove to Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, to protest against COVID-19 restrictions. It looks something like this.
That convoy of trucks and thousands of protesters on foot here at Parliament Hill with one message.
No, we're looking for freedom. We're looking for freedom. That's the only thing.
Every single thing that our governments have done, it just keeps on getting worse.
Against lockdowns and mandatory vaccinations in workplaces.
I cannot tolerate to see any longer because we're not living like we should be.
Against government-opposed lockdowns and mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations in workplaces.
You gotta tell the people the truth! Sean O'Shea, Global News, Ottawa.
To refresh, there's two main ways to think about protests: ideas-based critiques and tactics-based critiques. Ideas-based critiques attack the reasons behind protests. Tactics-based critiques attack the strategies behind protests. Now, let's look at what the ideas-based critique of the trucker convoy would say. The ideas-based critique of the trucker convoy would say that the reasons behind the trucker convoy were flawed. For example, under the ideas-based critique, it could be argued that COVID-19 restrictions are effective and are good things. They reduce transmission from the virus, they reduce deaths from COVID-19, and vaccines are just highly effective. So the ideas-based critique would actually say that the trucker convoy just made no sense. So the ideas-based critique would say that the trucker convoy was wrong in their protest. Now let's look at what the tactics-based critique would say about the trucker convoy protest. The tactics-based critique would say that the strategies behind the trucker convoy were flawed. For example, under the tactics-based critique, it could be argued that the strategies of the trucker convoy were simply not legitimate. For example, the tactics-based critique would say that blocking streets, honking horns so that people couldn't sleep at night, blocking international border crossings were illegitimate tactics. So it would say that the trucker convoy was wrong in its protest. For the most part, both the Ontario government, which is a provincial government in Canada, and the Canadian federal government argued against the trucker convoy protest using the tactics-based critique. For example, Ontario Premier Doug Ford said, "I understand it's frustrating for everyone, but when you start occupying borders, international trade crossings, it's game over. There's zero tolerance for that." Similarly, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that the trucker convoy was trying to blockade our economy, our democracy, and our daily citizens' lives, and that the convoy had to, quote, stop. Both Ford and Trudeau also said some other things to critique the tactics of the protesters. The problem with centering the tactics-based critique instead of the ideas-based critique is that the tactics of protesters are not intrinsically wrong. In other words, tactics from protesters are not wrong in every single situation. While the tactics of the trucker convoy seem illegitimate and extremist to most people, almost everyone would accept these same tactics in other situations. For example, consider that Canadians were in a context of Canadian apartheid. In this situation, white Canadians are given more rights than Canadians of all other races. In other words, there is legalized segregation. If there was protests against this segregation with blocking streets, with blocking international trade crossings, with honking horns, would any reasonable person really critique these kinds of tactics? No way! The same reasoning could be applied to other contexts where real injustice is taking place. So it can be concluded that the tactics of protesters don't provide sufficient reason to critique the protesters and the protest. So the basic idea is this: without the aid of the ideas-based critique, the tactics-based critique simply holds no weight. This applies to all protests. When analyzing protests of the past, present, and future, we need to analyze the ideas first and the tactics second. So next time there's a protest in your country and some politician starts complaining about the tactics of the protesters, ask yourself this: are the ideas of the protests good?